What is happening in BiggerPockets? It's Matt Faircloth. So there's a lot that goes into a rental closing, and we're going to talk about preparing yourself for a rental closing. And the reason why I say there's a lot that goes on is, well, even in my years in business, I find there's always stuff that shows up at the last second, things that come around and bite you, that you're scrambling the day of closing to try and find or figure out or whatever. There's a lot of moving parts. It's understood. A lot of times that's what happens. But what I want to go over with you guys today is what you need to do to prepare to minimize the running around and scurrying and the last second stuff that always comes up and everything like that when you prepare for a closing. And I'm talking about when you're preparing to buy a rental property. Now, when you go to sell, that's a whole other conversation when you go to sell. When you go to buy a rental property, this is what you need to do to prepare to closing, okay? So here's what we got. The first thing that I see, and this kind of varies state by state, but where I do business and I see in most other states, you've got a straight title company, okay? Got a title and legal stuff. Now, what I mean by the title and legal is there's a title company that's going to go and check the chain of title for the property, who the prior owners were, who the liens on the property are, everything like that. And the title work that needs to get taken care of before closing is making sure that the liens that are on the property, liens are things like mortgages, maybe real estate tax liens, maybe there was a contractor that the prior owner got upset with and the contractor put a mechanic's lien on the property. We're buying an apartment building right now in Kentucky. And the local town had some liens on the property from code violations from work that the owner did, or from violations that he had from a few of his units that hadn't been taken care of properly. So they fined him, and then that turned into a lien. Okay, all those things that are on title on the property have to get disclosed, and so you need to read that title report and make sure that everything's going to get taken off at closing, and make sure you're aware of all of it. Make sure that the seller has all their payoffs in place. Make sure that they're aware that, oh geez, did you know that some contractor 15 years ago put a $15,000 lien on your property and you didn't know about it? Well, all those things need to get disclosed, and the seller needs to be able to deliver you clean title with all that stuff taken off and paid off through the closing. The legal side of closing has to do with things like the contracts that are there. Obviously, when you put a property under contract, you want to make sure that that all that looks good. That typically happens in the beginning once you put it under agreement. But there are things on the legal side in your contract. A lot of times there's a timeline in there that says, well, okay, our due diligence is for 30 days. Our financial period that we have to get our financing lined up is for this period, and then we have to close on this day, okay? So make sure that all the legal ramifications that are in those contracts with regards to timeline are being met as you go all the way up to your closing. So title and legal tend to go together. Most of the time, if you do have a lawyer, your lawyer is going to be reviewing the title work and working with you to make sure title is going to be clean at closing. So I'm putting these two together, but there's a lot of title and legal stuff that have to happen before closing, and most of the time it's through an attorney, or perhaps your title company might provide you an attorney or provide you with a consultant that can work through it. If it's through you, make sure that you're either using the BiggerPockets forums, or make sure you're using someone who's been through a lot of this before. If you're doing it all yourself, they can guide you through reviewing title reports and making sure the title is clean at closing for yourself, okay? The next thing that's an issue that has to there's a lot of loose ends that have to get tied up before closing is tenant issues for a rental, okay? So, okay, you're buying a rental property, you're buying people's homes, okay? Probably if it's a multifamily, a lot of people call the place that you're purchasing their home, and so you need to make sure that you have, this sounds silly, but I've bought property, and this is, I've heard other people tell this too. They didn't have the tenant's contact information after closing, and we've done that too. We're like, oh geez, I got to call the seller after closing and say, hey, what's the tenant's cell phone number? Or how do I get a hold of that person? If we go knock on the door and introduce ourselves, or have the property manager do that. It's important to get that before closing, to get the tenant's contact information, and beyond that, you also want to get the tenant contact info. Sounds stupid, but believe me, I promise you, sometimes these sellers disappear after closing, and so if you don't want to go knocking on the tenant's door and introducing yourself or having your property manager do that, which is good business, but it'd be nice if you could also send them a phone call or an email or a text message to have the property manager introduce themselves immediately, right? So you also, on the tenant side, and this is preparing for closing, a big thing, is you want to make sure that you're getting properly credited for the tenant's rents. And the legal contract is going to define exactly how that has to go down, but you're going to get prorated for a certain amount of the rent for that month. So let's say you close on the 15th. That's roughly in the middle of the month. So maybe you're going to get exactly 50% of the rent. Maybe the seller is going to get 50%. Sometimes the seller will give you whatever they've collected up until that point, and it's up to you to go collect the rest, especially for large multifamily. It goes down that way. You want to talk to your attorney on how the rents are going to be handed over, because there's a million different ways you can handle rent turnover at closing. Some people prefer to close on the 31st. Some people like to close on the 1st because it affects how the rents get handled. I don't really have much of a preference because it just is what it is. You kind of work it out. But the contract needs to clearly define how the rents get handled, and you want to make sure that the title company has a rent credit on there for you, because the last thing you want to do is to buy a rental property and then the responsibility is 100% on you to go chasing tenants around and make sure that they pay their rent. You want to make sure the current owners done their side of that up until closing. So rent credits. There's something called a tenant estoppel certificate. That typically happens mostly on commercial, but I've seen it done on residential too. A tenant estoppel certificate is a document. I believe that if you have a pro membership in BiggerPockets, you can get that through on the lease documents. I believe that's out there. If not, your attorney on this side can get it for you. And an estoppel certificate is pretty much a one-page document that says, my name is Joe and Jane Smith. We live in this unit. And this is how much we pay per month. This is how much our security deposit is. And they just sign off on it on their own hand and confirm that the major components of the lease are true. And it's signed with their own hand a couple of days before closing. It's good business to get that, because then after closing, the tenant can't say, well, what are you telling me? I owe you $700 a month. I only pay $500. Me and Larry, the landlord, had a handshake agreement that my rent was $500 a month. You know, and you could pull up the lease and says, no. But here's my receipts that I was only paying him $500. So that to make sure that there's not a disagreement between you and the tenant estoppel certificate is a good way to make sure the tenant's on board with the major components of the lease. The only way you can make sure that you get those is in the legal side of the agreement when you put the property under contract. But before closing, you want to review those and make sure that everything looks good. And like I said, on commercial, you always see tenant estoppel certificates. On residential, they happen or they don't. They're only going to happen if you ask for them. And obviously, you're going to get a copy of the lease, okay? Estoppel, ESTOPPEL, and lease. Those are two things you want to get handed over to you, okay? And the last thing, and I mentioned this already in the tenant estoppel certificate, you want to make sure that you're getting security deposits, okay? In most states, if the landlord says to you, well, I don't have a security deposit for those tenants, they'll try and say, well, they never gave me a security deposit. Well, as I understand, in most states, legally, it's the landlord's obligation to collect a security deposit, and if they don't have a security deposit, they still have to produce one, okay? And I've also seen people say like, oh, well, that tenant owed me money, and so I'm keeping that security deposit to pay him back for rent that they owed. Or they'll come up with an excuse on why they don't have the security deposit, and most likely it's because the landlord you're buying the property from put the security deposit in what I call the HIP National Bank. And put it here and said, okay, security deposit, I'll get it back to you when you move out. Worry about that later. First of all, landlords aren't supposed to do that. It's illegal for them to do it, for them to put security deposits in their pocket. That's another blog topic we can get into on how to handle security deposits in another conversation. But if a landlord tells you, yeah, he had a security deposit, but I decided to keep it, or they used it up, or I gave it back to him, or something like that, if the lease calls for it, they have to produce it. And in some states, whether the lease calls for it or not, the landlord's obligated to hold a security deposit. So you really need to investigate security deposits and make sure that you're getting at least what the tenant agreed that they handed over to the landlord through the estoppel certificate. But at the most, what state law requires that they give you. And that should come over the table at closing as a part of the settlement sheet is security deposits for all units. Okay? And I've heard all the stories told on why landlords don't have security deposits. Check with your lawyer on that, because the stories are either, they may be true, but it's probably not going to hold up. And the last thing you want is this tenant to come back to you as their new owner saying, hey, where's my security deposit? And then you are at fault, not the prior owner that went on down the road. Okay, next thing you got to get squared away at closing is your loans, okay? Now, On the lending side, if you are working with a private lender that maybe you've got out of your own network, as I talk about a lot in my book, Raising Private Capital, that could be who you're working with as a lender. Your title company needs a copy of all their loan documents and everything that's going to get filed on title ahead of closing. You cannot walk into closing with loan docs that this title company's never reviewed before and approved that they're legal with state law, because they're going to be the one that's going to be filing it with the county for you. So you want to have these loan docs sent to the title company ahead of time, before closing, okay? And you want to have them reviewed by your lender, of course. And if you're working with a commercial lender, like a bank or whatever, most likely the loan docs came from your lender ahead of time and they wrote them, or maybe even hired a lawyer to write, which, by the way, most of the time when banks hire lawyers, you have to pay them as a legal fee for bigger commercial transactions. So, but that's neither here nor there. All those loan documents and all the loan negotiations and everything that documents that loan needs to get sent over to the title company. And the lender also needs to know when they have to send their money to the title company, because the lender most likely is not going to send the money to you. They're going to send it to the title company so that the title company can hand it over to the seller and give them their portion. If you're getting construction money at closing too, they'll cut you a check. But the money's likely from the lender not going to touch your hands. It's going to go straight to the title company at closing. Okay? So all the loan agreements and loan covenants need to get handled before closing. And the last item, and I've seen people have to try and do this one at the closing table, which really stinks. You don't want to have to do that. You don't have to deal with this. Now, in big real estate transactions, this can slow your deal down a lot, and that is insurance. I've seen people having to call their insurance company at closing saying, hey, I need insurance on a duplex that I'm purchasing. You don't want to do that because you're not going to get very good coverage. If you put your insurance agent in a corner like that to make them go and jump and get you a policy right there at the table, you're not, and hopefully there's insurance people watching this that they can jump in on the comment section and agree with me, hopefully, that's not a good position to put your insurance carrier in, because they're just going to find whatever they can find immediately so you can close. You're much better getting bids from insurance carriers and getting everything lined up well before closing and knowing what you're going to do with, and getting in good conversations with your insurance carrier, making sure you have the right deductible and the right coverage limits, and making sure you're covered on all the different covenants that have to do with rental purchases and everything like that. So you're not just waiting to the last second and calling to make sure that you have coverage at closing, because your lender is going to require it. So you might as well get this lined up anyway. And if you're buying a big transaction, like the apartment building that we're doing, this lender wanted to review the insurance policy like a week before closing to make sure that everything looked good and it covered their approvals and everything like that, and it covered everything they wanted to see. So this is something you have to get into well in advance. Okay, so this is a general idea of things you have to get done before closing. There's even more stuff, like for the tenant side, can you get getting a copy of the keys, or making sure you can get keys before closing, making sure you walk the property. If it's a smaller property that's right in your own backyard, make sure you walk it right before closing. But I want to leave it up to you guys to add more conversations here on things that need to be done before closing on a rental purchase. What else is there? Because I want everybody to support each other and make sure you guys are all prepared for closings. There is a ton of moving parts that happen in a rental purchase, the purchase of a rental property, and it's only through conversations like this we can help each other be better prepared for this, so that we can be more profitable and show up strong for closing, so we can build our businesses. Cool. Thanks for watching. Looking forward to your comments. Have a great profitable week, BiggerPockets.